So let's get started. Today we're going to develop a simple aggregate supply and aggregate demand model, and so that's what we cover in Chapter 10. So up till now, we learned about GDP, unemployment, inflation. We learned about how they're measured, but now we're going to learn a simple model where we actually determine these levels within a model. So the model will show how GDP or national income and the price level are determined by the interaction of aggregate demand and supply. And we'll see that these three things are very interrelated, and in order to understand one, you need to understand all three. And so the model will help that sort of thing. And it's fairly straightforward. It has a lot of similar flavors as the supply and demand model, but the underlying issue or story behind, say, the curves are much different. So our model is in the price level and real GDP space. So we have the price level on the vertical axis and real GDP on the horizontal axis. And we have three important curves. One is the aggregate demand curve. The other one is the short run aggregate supply curve. And the other one's simple. We have a vertical line drawn at potential output, which we will refer to as the long run aggregate supply. Okay, so let's look at each of these in turn. So the aggregate demand curve, it's like a demand curve in an individual market, but it's an aggregate demand curve. So it's, at a certain price level in the economy, what is the total value, real value of GDP? And so it's the relationship between price level and real expenditure or total spending in the economy. And so we're measuring it as real GDP, so that's how much would be spent. Okay, so it's shown, as a schedule or a curve, just like a demand function. So here's an example of an aggregate demand curve. It's downward sloping, and at a price level of 140, again, remember the price level, this is like an index value, and it is derived from like a consumer price index. So it's based on the average level of prices in the economy. So if it's here, we would expect real GDP to be something like maybe $6 billion in this example, and if it's lower, it would be higher. So there's a negative relationship. And so if we're moving along the aggregate demand curve, we're talking about changes in the price. Okay, so this just really illustrates that it's inverse relationship. Hello? So if you can, just use your mics, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, so in microeconomics, we learned that the demand curve for an individual good is downward sloping because it is assumed that the prices of other goods remain constant and that the buyer's incomes also remain constant. So remember, when we drew a demand curve in the micro section of the course, we were holding constant all other determinants of the quantity demanded, right? And we just had the price on there and the quantity demanded. Now, of course, if the price of one good rises, the demand for the demand for the good itself falls because the relative price of other goods is lower, and because buyers' real incomes will be reduced if they purchase good X at a higher price. The aggregate demand curve, however, is defined in terms of the price level. So a change in the price level implies that many are changing, right? Remember, it's based on a basket of goods. And so, here we're going to say there's many prices changing, including the wage paid to work. So it's a little bit different, but we're just think of the wages in here as a price as well. As wages change, so do income. So it's not possible to assume that prices and incomes remain constant in the construction of the aggregate demand curve. So so that begs the question, then why is it downward sloping? Why do we buy less when our aggregate income rises or real GDP as much as prices? So there's different effects. So we have an aggregate demand curve. Okay, so we're given different price levels here. So we're given different price levels here. We're given different levels of real GDP. If we plot it, we'll get our aggregate demand curve. So as the price level increases, so think about being maybe at point C here. As the price level increases, the goods and services increase, but incomes will also increase. And remember, GDP is income as well, right? Remember, we can have the spending approach or the income approach. This is also income. So we have the income changing as well. However, less real GDP is bought for two reasons. The first is the wealth effect, and the second is the foreign trade effect. Okay, so two factors cause the aggregate demand curve to be downward sloping. The wealth effect means that higher prices of goods and services decrease the real value of financial assets, stocks, bonds, any of your savings. So basically, when you have, so we're not holding, income or But still, if you have prices increasing, the overall price level increases, then there's going to be higher prices of your savings and that sort of thing will change. So you could think of it as feeling poorer, so they have a higher percentage of their income and spend a lower percentage on consumption. Okay, so again, if prices increase, then that decreases the value of financial assets. So basically, you're going to think, you just feel a bit poor. And then the other effect is on foreign trade. Well, before I finish that, so lower prices of goods and services means the real value of financial assets increases, which increases people's sense of wealth, so they might allocate more of their income to consumption and less saving. And the foreign trade effect means that, so if our prices are higher relative to another country, then we're not going to be able to sell as much of our X, right? But if our prices are lower, we can sell more of our X. So that's the idea there. So we can think of it being downward sloping for those two reasons. So aggregate demand changes are shown by shifts in the aggregate demand curve. So an increase in spending causes a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. A decrease in spending causes a leftward shift in the aggregate demand. Do not confuse changes in quantity demanded, which happens only when price change. Okay? So changes in aggregate demand. So suppose there's an increase in government purchases, and that causes an increase in real expenditures at every price level. So if we have an increase in government expenditures, we're going to say that the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. So we're just going to represent that with a shift to the right in aggregate demand. So basically, we have more spending, right? So there's going to be a high, this real GDP level, which measures the expenditures at each price level, is going to be higher. So at this price level, we're going to be over to the right by this horizontal distance. So aggregate demand changes are caused by aggregate demand factors related to each of the four main spending components. So consumption is the most important. When we're thinking, one of the main drivers of consumption, of course, is your disposable income. Disposable income is just what is left over after you're done paying taxes to the government. Okay. So real increases or decreases in wealth, those will definitely affect how much you consume, and consumer expectations about future incomes and prices. So expectations plays a role, and of course interest rates are important because durable goods, that sort of thing, like home appliances or a car. In some cases, people will borrow for this, and so if the interest rates are higher, that makes them more expensive. But if the interest rates are very low, it's credit's cheap, there'll be more spending as a result. Now, investment spending also, of course, relies on interest rates because companies tend to borrow many times to expand their plant, etc. So the interest rates play a role there for the same reason as I discussed. Of course, if firms are getting very positive sales forecasts and optimistic about the future, then that would mean they're more likely to invest more than the other way around. Now, government purchases is the third item, and our last item would be net export. And so one thing that could, is related to net exports is foreign income. So if a trading partner has a large increase, their economy is booming, well, they're going to tend to import more. Okay? And so that's how how foreign incomes would relate to spending. It would be through them. And of course, exchange rates play a role as well. If the exchange rate depreciates, then we would end up exporting more and importing less. So that would be a positive increase in expenditures. Whereas if the exchange rate appreciates in value, less people will buy from us, and then since our currency is worth more, we may import, and so that'll make net exports decline. And so we're adding these four things together to get aggregate expenditures. And so if we have a exchange rate, the net export part of that will be adding less. Now, investment demand is the relationship between the interest rate and investment. So the demand for investment is how much is invested. There's a strong relationship between that and the real rate of return and the real interest. So businesses pursue projects whose real rate of return, so it's the return after inflation, is expected to exceed the cost, right? The real interest rate, borrowing cost. So you don't want to do a business project if the real return is less than the cost that you have to pay to borrow money to do the project. So this means the investment demand curve must be downward sloping, since of interest rates as the price of renting money. We don't consider home purchases by individuals as investment. Expensive consumption items like cars are affected by the interest rate level too. Home purchases are not really considered investment. I guess you could think of basically there you would. It's almost as if you're renting the house to yourself, and then what would be included though is your the monthly how much you're contributing to the mortgage every month. So that portion. But in 1 year, the entire value of a home will be included rest of that. So an investment demand curve, this is very straightforward. It's just a downward sloping curve. On the horizontal axis, you have the number of the amount of investment, and then on the vertical axis, you have the real rate of return and real interest rate. So if the real interest rate is say 12% in this example, then you wouldn't have any investment. If it falls to 8%, then you would have $30 billion, etc. Now, as the real interest rate decreases, you can think of how more investment projects would be undertaken because each for a certain threshold that you would need to considering your cost to borrow and then thinking of the real interest rate, there's a certain level that will be given that lower interest rate that will just be more profitable to go ahead with as the interest rate falls. So again, here, if the interest rate is 8%, only project A and B would be carried out since their estimated real rates of return are greater or equal. So this is the real interest rate. And 1 second. Okay, sorry, my dog is thinks he wants to be part of the lecture as well. So anyways, the main idea here is that you have a downward sloping investment demand. So if the real interest rate is 8%, then in this example, we would say projects A and B would be undertaken. And if it goes down to 4%, then all of them, A, B, C, and D, would be pursued as. So I'm just trying to think here. So if they don't really give us the real rate of return. I may just look at this slide a little bit carefully later and see if it needs to be read. It's not very clear how they're getting project A, and B. Oh yeah, so of course. So at 12%, there's going to be no projects, right? Because this investment demand curve is telling us how much will be invested at each of the real rate of interest, okay? So we know then that if the interest rate goes down to 8%, we will get an increase in investment of $30 billion. And that is, these consistent with A and B. So the real interest rate then would be, if you just think of, these two projects then, the real rate of their return would be positive, right? If the interest rate falls to 8%. And then all of them will be profitable if the interest rate falls to 4%. Okay, so now let's talk about shifts in the demand curve. So the aggregate demand curve increases and the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right with the following. So again, this is sort of related. You think of the C plus I plus D plus net exports. So the first one here is an increase in consumption due to a rise in disposable income, a rise in wealth, unrelated to a change in the price level, because that's already on the diet, and an expected rise in prices or incomes or a fall in interest rate. It will also shift to the right if there's an increase in investment due to a fall in interest rates, an expected rise in profits, if the government increases their spending, and if there's an increase in net exports due to a rise in foreign incomes or a depreciation of Canadian dollar. It would shift to the left for the same reasons but the opposite, right? So instead of an increase in government spending, we have a decrease. So these are the same things, they're just moving in the opposite direction. Okay, so make sure you know this list. If any of these change, then we know we're going to be shifting the demand. Okay, so let's just do a quick active learning question. I'll open up a poll. So according to the law of aggregate demand, as the price level rises, aggregate, what's the correct answer here? I'll just give you five seconds or so. Okay, 3, 2, 1. So only 8 of you got your responses in. You want to click on it if you haven't done so already? Okay, let's see how you did. Okay, so only half of you who answered got the right answer. So the answer is B. Real quantity demanded decreases. Here's another question. In the figure, the shift from point C to point B might be the result of which of the following? Okay, go ahead. The poll's open. Okay, everyone got the responses in. The the answer here is C, right? And the reason why is the other ones, so A, B, and D, are all talking about something that changes that's actually on the graph, on the horizontal or vertical axis. So in those cases, that would be a movement along the curve. Okay, but here we're talking about a shift. Okay, so let's look at the impact of each of the following trends on the aggregate demand curve. So the federal government cuts taxes for low-income households. So that affects disposable income, right? So which direction would that shift the curve? You could just type that into the chat function if you want. Yeah, they would shift it to the right. What if there's a slump in share prices on Canadian stock market? So we're just talking about share prices here. Well, that's related to the wealth effect, sort of. So for the first one, the AD curve would shift to the right, and then here we would get that the aggregate demand curve would shift to the left. Okay, so this isn't really related to the wealth effect, but it sort of is, because here you're saying, but the wealth effect was related to the price level changing, and so I don't know, you have some investment and it's worth $2,000. You have some $2,000 in your savings account or something like that. Then if prices go up, the purchasing power you can get from that stored wealth is going to be lower. But here we're just talking about a wealth effect. We're just saying that people are probably going to be a little more thrifty because their wealth effect is lower. But the change here is not from the overall price level. We're just talking about the value of the assets themselves, so the nominal value of the assets have fallen. What if the price level were to rise in Canada? How would that affect the aggregate demand curve? Okay, well, there would be no shift of price levels on the diagram, so that would be a movement along the aggregate demand curve. If Canadian interest rates fall, well, if interest rates fall, credit is cheaper, right? And so that would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. If the Canadian dollar appreciates against the US dollar, how would that affect the aggregate demand curve? Anyone want to take a crack at that? Yes, that's right. So it would shift to the left here. And that's because our goods are more expensive now, so our exports will fall, but it'll be cheaper for us to buy from other countries, so our imports would increase. And what if Canadian business is less confident about the future? Well, we know that would shift it to the left. Okay. Now we're going to talk now about the aggregate supply curve. So we're looking at the other side of the market. The aggregate supply curve is the relationship between the general price level and real output in an economy. Okay, and so that's the space that we're working in. And so what's this relationship? Is it positive or negative? Well, it's going to be positive, and the aggregate supply is the total of all the firm market supply curves. It's shown as a schedule of curves. So we're also referring to this as the short run aggregate supply curve. And the reason why we're referring to the short run curve is because when we draw this curve, we're holding constant input price, like wages or price of other inputs, like copper, steel, or whatever is being used in the economy. So, and we're thinking about that as on the aggregate, so the all input prices in the economy, we're holding those constant. And so, short run, we're thinking those won't change. And again, just if you remember from micro, if you recall, a particular firm would determine their quantity by setting their marginal revenue equal to the marginal cost, and so they would produce this amount of output here. Okay, so profit is maximized where MR equals MC at the point A, for example, here. Output's 200, and so what would happen if the firm's output? What would happen to the firm's output if demand increased, enabling the price to rise? Well, the firm's supply curve is the upward sloping marginal part of the marginal cost curve. A similar effect happens with the economy as a whole when prices. So let's go back there. So here, if there's an increase in demand, for example, we're going to be shifting this demand curve to the right. The marginal revenue is also going to shift along with it, right? If you remember how we got marginal revenue. So here we're going to have an increase in output of 220. So so this is just one firm, and just we're saying that in the overall economy, a similar effect would happen as a whole when prices change. So again, here we're thinking about the relationship between the price level and the amount that's going to be offered for sale, the aggregate short run aggregate supply. So we're just showing here that it's a positive relationship. So if there's demand increasing in a lot of different markets, that's going to cause the price to increase, and it's also going to cause more to be supplied on the market. So again, a positive relationship. Okay, so the aggregate supply curve will have a positive relationship. When we draw it, again, it's very important to remember this. We're assuming the production costs remain constant, and this sort of the idea for this comes from Keynes, who in the noticed that it's a long story, but he noticed that things like wages weren't falling. And if you're in a recession, what should happen, what economists thought would happen in the past before the Great Depression, is that prices and wages, for example, will adjust, and so if wages fall, there'll be an increase in the demand for labor. So all of that adjustment would occur, and that's how we would get out of the recession. And before the Great Depression, it was thought that this should happen, somewhat quickly. But the Great Depression was really bad, and it was really bad for a long time. And wages were very sticky; they didn't fall, and there was still very high unemployment even 10 years after the stock market crashed in 1929. So he came up with this sort of model where you have a short run aggregate price curve. So instead of just thinking we immediately go to the long run, we have this sort of intermediary state. And so he came up with this idea. In the short run, we're going to say that wages are sticky or fixed. They're just fixed. And so that's the relationship between the price level of goods and services and expenditures on real GDP, but holding constant any input price. Okay, and at low output, such as point A, businesses produce significantly below capacity. So this would be like a major recession. And here, though, the aggregate supply curve is relatively flat. So the amount that the price level will go up with real GDP, think of this in a recession, you're not going to have that much pressure on prices. Okay, so if you think of the demand curve shifting on this supply curve, then if you say went from A to B, the effect on prices isn't going to be too much because there's still lots of economic capacity in the economy. But if you have the same demand shift between point C and point D, then in that situation, the economy is already producing at its potential output. So you could think of everyone's working, we're using our resources fully, and so if all of a sudden the economy is stimulated a lot, well, there's not, you could think of there being lots of shortages in all of the different markets, and then prices will tend to get bid up. Okay, so that's why we draw it steeper when we get towards potential output. Okay, so the short run aggregate supply curve, again, it's the total quantity of goods and services that firms would be willing and able to produce at various prices, but we're assuming input prices remain constant. So in the short run, wages and the prices of raw material and other resources are assumed to remain unchanged. And that's part of John Maynard Keynes' ideas of how these things can be sticky. They don't change very rapidly, and that's was witnessed in the Great Depression. And so the reason why it would be the curve is upward sloping then is very simple. If the price level increases, the costs of input stays the same, then you're basically saying that firms' profits are going to be higher per unit, right? If prices increase, if you're a business, so you can sell your good for higher price, but your expenses don't change, well, then you're going to make more money, right? That's the idea. And so we just say that firms will take advantage of short-run profitability when the price level rises. And so that's why we have an upward sloping short-run aggregate spike. And again, as I mentioned before, it becomes steep above potential output because at a relatively large, if you had, the best way to think about it is if you had an increase in demand, some reason, maybe increase in government spending or tax cuts, and the economy is already producing at its potential, then you're just going to cause prices to increase. I mean, firms could respond to the increase in demand by maybe running their factory 24 hours or, having workers work long hours, but it's not exactly sustainable for a very long time. So we can exceed potential output, but not in a sustainable way because you have to be overworking your capital and labor, right? So, so that demand can so essentially when you're near potential output and then you stimulate the economy, you're going to end up with, shortages in markets and prices getting bid up. So that's the idea of why it becomes more steep around potential output. And again, we can also think about our profit maximization in the micro example. So what would happen to the firm's output if the demand remained stable, but its marginal and average cost decreased? Okay, so if your costs decrease, then you would get something like that. So the curves are going to shift down. And so before we're at point A, now I don't have point B in there, sorry. So now the marginal revenue curve, sorry, this increase. So, here we have our marginal revenue curve being the same. Now it's going to intersect with the marginal cost curve at a higher output. So here, again, we see that we're just saying again, there's a relationship, positive relationship here between prices and the quantity. So here, the quantity would increase. So don't worry too much about that, but I'm just trying to add a little bit to it. So the aggregate supply curve is just drawn for fixed input prices, and there's reasons why it can shift. Okay, so a short run increase in aggregate supply would occur when, obviously, if we draw that for fixed input prices, then if input prices change, the short run aggregate supply curve will change. So a short run increase in aggregate supply occurs when the aggregate supply curve shifts rightwards while potential output stays constant. Okay, so the short run and the long run aggregate supply curve are related, but the long run aggregate supply curve is not based on short term things like prices. It's basic. You can think of the long run aggregate supply curve or the potential GDP as they're more related to real things. So the amount of potential we have in terms of being able to produce goods and services is based on things like our education levels in the economy, so our skills, the number of people in the labor force, the number of natural resources we have. So, it's related to our scarce resource. And so that's what determines our long run ability to supply. In the short run, though, you can have input prices changing, which would change that behavior. But in the long run, what really determines how much you produce is based on real things. Okay. And of course, we say that a short run decrease in aggregate supply would occur when the aggregate supply curve shifts, all potential output stays constant. So this is just showing an example of the short run aggregate supply curve shifting to the right. So what could cause that? Well, anything that could cause changes in the cost of production, any of the input prices, like a fall in wages. Okay. So of course, if you look at the diagram, the movement is going to be greatest at lower price levels where substantial excess capacity exists, and then it won't be as much when we get up here. And again, if you think about what our potential is to produce something, if our class was stranded on a deserted island, what really determines how much we can produce is based on our skills, our human capital, our natural resources on the island, whether we have tools or not to catch fish and stuff like that. That's really what determines your potential output. But in the short run, the wages and stuff like that can come into play. So if there's if obviously then if there's any improvement in any of those factors that determine our potential output, like the number of people or the amount of natural resources we have, that's going to shift the long run aggregate supply curve, that in that case to the right if there's an improvement in those factors. And so it will also shift the short run as well. Okay. But only input prices will shift. If it's just input prices, then the aggregate supply curve shifts, not the long. So here is an illustration where so here at that point that's indicated there, it's where the short run aggregate supply curve is exactly equal to the potential output. And so if something happens, for example, that improves our ability or ability to produce goods and services, like in the long run, so anything like if we have an increase in the labor force, maybe we have immigration. You could think of better education of the population, some innovations in technology that allow us to produce stuff with less labor. These types of things would shift the potential output to the right. And so it would also shift the aggregate supply curve to the right as well. So aggregate supply changes are caused by aggregate supply factors related to either short run or long run trends. Short run changes in aggregate supply are caused by varying input prices only. Okay, so the aggregate supply curve in the short run again can shift because of the potential output shifting, but it can also shift because of wages. it's a short run supply curve. But the potential output will only shift if real things change. So things like resource supplies, productivity, government policies as well. But the main thing here is you're thinking of, again, we're stranded on an island. What are our scarce resources? And that's there's our scarce resources. So we have labor, land, natural resources, our tools. And so if any of those things change, then the potential output changes. And then government policies could make those things change. So a decrease in input prices would result in the aggregate supply curve shifting to the right. So this could be due to a fall in wages, a fall in raw material prices, and the opposite for when it would shift to the left. So if there's an increase in wages or input prices, or a rise in the price of any inputs, raw materials, copper, whatever is used for that, so that would shift it to the left. And so if there's an increase in supplies of economic resources, so if there's an increase in the number of people, or there's new tools or technology, that shifts both of the curves. Okay, so any of those things would shift both of the curves to the right. And then on the right here, we just have the opposite. So these things would shift both of the curves to the left. So we'll just do a couple quick questions here. So what is aggregate supply? I'll open up poll. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Okay, half of you got it right. So the aggregate supply curve shows you the different, for different price levels in the economy, what would be the amount that would be produced by firms at those various prices. So in A, it says the aggregate quantity produced by all sellers at various or different prices. So that's the answer. B says that the aggregate quantity produced by all sellers at equilibrium. Well, that's not true, because in order to have an equilibrium, you need the demand curve, and we know that each of these are separate. When we draw the aggregate supply curve, it has nothing to do with the aggregate demand curve. It's when we put them together that we're determining things, right? And then C, it's the aggregate quantity produced by all sellers at full employment. Well, that's not. It's just at different price levels what would be produced. And only one of those points on the supply curve would correspond to full employment, and that would actually be the point where potential output is. D, it says the aggregate quantity produced by all sellers at the current price level. Well, the current price level would just be 1 point, and so the aggregate quantity would be, it would just be plotting at 1 point. So here the correct answer is A. Okay, why is the aggregate supply curve upward sloping? Okay, go ahead. Here's your poll. Okay, 3, 2, 1, and 0. All right, get your responses in. Okay, most of you got it right. So 55% of you who answered got it right. So the correct answer here is B. Now, the other ones don't really make sense. So A, it says since nominal wages increase when production rises, then so too must the price. Well, that doesn't really make any sense. Higher prices increase then. Since when do higher prices increase demand? So that doesn't make sense. Higher prices mean higher real wages. It's actually the opposite. Your real wage would be lower if prices rise. So let's see. I think there might be one more question. Okay, so we'll just go through this one together. So it says to identify the impact of each of the following trends on aggregate supply. So the capital stock, so our tools and things like that. If we're thinking of our deserted island, that means we have an increase in our fishing rods, something like that. So we have more capital to get food. We can get it quicker and faster than if we caught fish with our hands. So in this case, we're saying, we have a modern economy that has more capital. What are we talking about here? So actually, you can just maybe put your answer in the chat. Is this talking about the shift in the aggregate supply curve and the long run aggregate supply curve, or just the short run aggregate supply? And then what direction is it going to shift it in? Anyone? Yeah, so long run thing here, so both of them will shift. What direction will they shift? Right, exactly. Thank you. Okay, so in this case, the short run aggregate supply curve would shift to the right, and so would the long run aggregate supply curve. What about a government policy that introduces new environmental regulations on Canadian business? So this is something that would affect the long run ability, right? Because there's these regulations now that have followed. And so it would affect both, and it would shift them to the left. Okay. What about if the price of electricity increased? Yeah. So short run left, good. And wages, of course, is another input price, so that's just going to affect the short run aggregate supply curve. And which direction would it shift? Yeah, it would shift to the right because wages are now lower, they're cheaper. So CE, we have a global warming, so this is again more of a long run thing, so it would shift it to the left. Now, if we have a fall in immigration, and so the size of the Canadian labor force, that's going to be, is it long run or short run? Anyone? Yeah, long run, and it would shift to the left. The rate of adoption of new technologies by Canadian firms increases. So we have more technology. That's definitely a long run thing, and it would shift it to the right. Yeah, that's part two. Okay, so now we're going to put them together. We looked at, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve separately. We're going to combine them. And so similar to the market for an individual product, the forces underlying the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve will push the economy to the intersection of both of the curves. And again, we can think of, well, if we want to think about why that's the case, we can think about price levels that aren't associated with the equilibrium. And so if the price level is above the equilibrium, that would result in surpluses, and so there'd be an unintended increase in inventories, and which we will call here positive unplanned investment. So we categorize buildings of inventories as investment, okay, but we say that it's unplanned, and so that would tend to lower the price because when you have surpluses, firms are going to want to get rid of those. They don't want to hold on to that inventory, and then if the price level is below the equilibrium, that would result in an unintended decrease in inventories or negative unplanned investments, and that would raise the price level towards equilibrium. So again, similar to a single market, there's a story for why the economy would move towards the center, to the intersection, right? So if here the price level was above the equilibrium at 200, we would have a surplus. So real output would exceed expenditures. So what people would want to buy would be less than what the firms are producing, and so there's going to be a tendency for the price level to fall. When the price level is below the equilibrium, say at 120, we would have negative unplanned investment, and we would expect price level to increase. And so the only point where all the markets clear in the economy is at a price level of 160. So again, an equilibrium is just where there's no tendency to move. Okay, so any price levels not at the equilibrium price level will make that there is a tendency to move, and that move is going to be in the direction of where the two curves intersect. Okay, so this can be understood by looking at the flows of income payments and purchases that connect resource and product markets. So we can think of injections. Okay, so you can think of, if you remember, I think we briefly talked about the circular flow. So you can think about the flow of income. When companies produce stuff, the value of that production is equal to incomes, right? Because the laborers will get paid a wage for making the stuff, capital owners get paid, etc., and anything left over is profit and income to the business owner. Okay, so if there's no leakages from that, so suppose you have production that becomes income, and then if people are not able to save their money or buy imports, or they don't have to pay any taxes, so then you're saying that they must spend all of their income. So if that were the case, you would just have this flow of income, and if you think about this circular flow as like a hose with water in it, and the pressure just stays the same, and there's no way for any of the pressure, for that pressure to change at all. Okay, so if that's how the economy was, if you're, for whatever reason, maybe the money you used is not, you're not able to save it, it doesn't store its value, something like that. It's just thinking abstractly. So you would just have production, whatever that level is, that becomes income, that's spent, and then the same amount's going to get produced again, that's going to become income, and it's spent. And so you just keep going around in this circular flow. But of course, people can save money, and if people save money, that would be a leakage. People can import goods, so it's money leaving the country, so that's a leakage. And the government can take some of your income in the form of taxes. So those three things are considered would be leakages. And so you can think of the economy, the pressure in the hose of the water, the analogy there, that pressure would be the economic activity in the economy. So if there's a leakage, we could think of the economy slowing down. So so let's suppose we do have these leakages, and but we're at a certain point where we're in equilibrium, and perhaps say the savings is offset by investment, and the taxes are equally offset by the government spending, and the inputs are equally offset by the exports. Or they don't have to each be offsetting each other. It would just be the total leakages would be equal to the total injection. But then all of a sudden something happens where everyone's thrifty and saves money, or a lot of people just buy imports, or the government increases taxes. If there's no corresponding change in the injections, then the economy will contract or slow down. Okay, so we can think of injections, and this textbook calls leakages withdrawals, same idea. So let's talk about the withdrawals first because I already mentioned them. So the withdrawals are savings, taxes, and import. And so these would divert from funds from the income spending stream in the economy. And but on the other hand, there are injections. So the corresponding injection related to savings would be investment. And that's the function of financial intermediaries, like deposit taking institutions or savings and loans banks. They take in people's savings and then they lend out money. Many times it could be for businesses for investment, but not just that. But we're just think of it here simply as there's just investment to keep things simple. Of course, they could lend money for someone to buy a car as well. And so we also have the leakage of taxes, and so the government's collecting money, but the injection, the corresponding injection would be when they buy stuff. And then inputs is a leakage, but the corresponding injection would be when other people buy from us. So we can think of the equilibrium in terms of this context. So only if injections equal withdrawals will the economy be in equilibrium. Okay, so actually we have our circular flow here. So the circular flow, the simple version has, well, the first version would have just businesses and households. We have okay, so let's start from the beginning. So we have, in any economy, you're going to have households and businesses. So households are just the people, and businesses, you can maybe think of as separate entities. Of course, they're owned by households. And so in the resource market, there's a flow of income from businesses to households, right? So there's money coming from businesses to households, and then the income also flows from households to businesses in the form of consumption spending. So again, businesses will provide income to households because the households are providing the factors of production, land, labor, capital, etc. And then because the households are providing the factors of production, land, labor, capital, etc. And then, so that's the resource market. So the resource market, you have, money being paid to households for what they provide to the businesses to make the goods and services. So labor is a good example, wages, and other sources of income. Whatever's left over after paying for wages, rent, land, and interest payments and all that stuff will be profit to the business owner, and the business owner is also a household, right? So the income's all going back. There's income flow from businesses to households, and that's in return for the factors of production. There's also a flow of income from households to businesses, and that's when people buy stuff from the businesses. Okay, so that's a flow of income going there. So if there are no leakages, so businesses would produce stuff, that becomes income, and then households would spend all of that income. So the businesses would have that income again, and they're going to make stuff, and then that income is going to go again to households, and you just keep going around and around. And the way it's set up now, there's no leakages, so there's no way for the economy to slow down. You're just getting this constant source of income that's generating production and spending. But of course, there are leakages. So this is my animation I did. So it's just, showing you can think of that as the pressure in a water hose with a certain pressure. But of course, there are financial intermediaries that allow households to save, okay? And so that's a leakage. The government takes taxes from households, and then we have, the rest of the world. So we have an open economy, and so we may buy stuff from the rest of the world. So that's, money leaving the circular flow. There's money leaving the circular flow in the form of taxes to the government, and there's money leaving the circular flow in terms of savings that go to financial intermediaries. And businesses are also taxed too. Now, so injections here, so that was the leakages. Now the injections are investment, government purchases, and export. Okay, and so we can see this is sort of a simple overview of the economy. But if you're just thinking about the flow of water going around in this level is at the full employment or potential output is another story. But the economy will be, you could think of maybe as a short run equilibrium. The leakages equals the investment. Okay, so again, when these two things are equal, and it's just not, savings doesn't have to be equal to investment and taxes equal to, it's just the sum of injections has to equal the sum of the withdrawals. So if something happens where the government increases spending, well, that's going to stimulate the economy if they don't increase taxes by the exact same amount at the same time. So in that case, total injections would exceed total withdrawals, and real output and spending would expand until a new balance is achieved. So the reason why a new balance would be achieved is that, if you have an increase in government spending, that's going to increase incomes, and the government may not have changed their, increased the tax rate or anything. The rate's the same, but people are going to be making more income, so they're going to be paying more taxes. So that sort of slows it down. People will be buying more imports. That will slow it down, and people will save more, a portion of that new income. And so those things slow it down until it gets to new level. And so basically, the withdrawals will increase as a result, and you'll end up getting to a new place where both will be equal. If total withdrawals exceed total injections, then the economy will be slowing down. So you can think of it like this. You have your withdrawals, you have your injections. The economy is only in equilibrium when the total withdrawals is equal to the total injection. And so then the circular flow is in balance. If injections are more, then the economy will be growing. If the withdrawals are more, then the economy will be shrinking. How do you like my animations? Any comments on them? I spent over an hour doing that, so I hope you like them. Okay, cool. Anyways, I hope you get the idea. So that's the idea behind the equilibrium. Now, it is possible for an equilibrium to occur at the economy's potential output. So again, up to now, this aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve can intersect at any level of real GDP. It doesn't have, it doesn't have to happen at potential output. So and that's exactly so it's this chapter should have maybe talked a little bit about the Great Depression and some of the motivation behind the model. So the key so before the Great Depression, the idea was that all markets clear very quickly, including the labor market. So if there's a surplus in the labor market, meaning you have a recession, then wages should fall, just like any price falls when you have a surplus. And so, the prices of goods and the prices of inputs should all adjust quickly so that the economy will always go back to full employment. That was the main idea, right? So if you get something that happens that causes a recession, well then, the prices of goods would fall. Then people will buy more, so the spending on the goods would increase, but also wages would fall and labor would get hired back. And so, because there's a tendency for all markets to go towards their equilibrium, when they're all in equilibrium, you get an efficient allocation of resources, and, in principle, there shouldn't be any unemployment, and we should be at potential output. But the problem is in the Great Depression, that wasn't happening very quickly. You had wages being stagnant, they weren't falling. Prices changed a bit. So Keynes came up with this idea that you can actually be stuck in this short run equilibrium. And so if this aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve intersect below potential output, that would be like in a recession. But he was saying, you're going to be in that circular flow, but at a lower pressure than what would be required for potential output. So you can kind of get stuck in a recession because there's no reason for firms to produce more and increase income if they're at a short equilibrium, they're selling what they're making, right? So how do the only way for the only thing you could really do, well, okay, so if you're stuck there are different things you can do. Well, we should talk about this later, but I'll just bring it up now quickly. Well, you could just wait. Eventually, wages and input prices will adjust. It just could take a very long time. You have wage contracts, unions, but eventually, with unemployment being high for long enough, you would expect wages to eventually fall, right? And so we could just wait. And then so when wages fall, the aggregate supply curve would be shifting to the right. And then that's how we would intersect the aggregate demand curve again at potential output. But Keynes's idea was, he had a famous quote, "In the long run, we're all dead." And he said, it's better to and this is a role for the government. The government can just shift that aggregate demand curve by increasing spending, borrowing and spending, and get us out of that deep recession and to do it much faster. And so there'd be less human suffering. So that's the idea where we're going and the idea behind this government. The government can just shift that aggregate demand curve by increasing spending, borrowing and spending, and get us out of that deep recession and to do it much faster. And so there'd be less human suffering. So that's sort of the idea where we're going and the idea behind this. So the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve could be far to the left of potential output. It could even be a little bit to the right. In that case, unemployment isn't the problem, but inflation is the problem. You can think of inflation and unemployment as the two economic evils. Where we want to be is what's depicted in this diagram right now. We want to be, we want firms producing what people want to spend, and we want that level to be at our potential. And so there's no unemployment, and there's no issues with so there's no issues with unemployment, and then no issues with inflation. So in this case, if we are producing at potential output, then we're going to say that the unemployment rate is the natural unemployment rate or the full employment unemployment rate. So it's where we want to be. There would be no cyclical unemployment here. I'm sure you know what business cycles are, but a business cycle is just a cycle of expansions and contractions in an economy. An expansion is a sustained rise in real output. A contraction is a sustained fall in real input. A peak of an expansion. Yeah, expansion is a sustained rise in real output, and so the peak is the point in the business cycle at which real output is at its highest, and then a contraction is when it falls, and so a trough is the point on the business cycle where it's at its lowest. So contractions are caused by a decrease in aggregate demand. And that's going to be magnified by the reactions of both households and businesses, spend less due to pessimism about the future. So something usually happens. So the last big recession was because of the financial crisis in the US. Basically, you had a somewhat of a bubble type thing. You had a lot of, it was very complicated, but you had some very strange things going on with people being able to buy homes. They were basically fooled into these mortgages that had high spikes in the interest rates after a certain period of time. And then a lot of people who weren't creditworthy were given loans for new homes and all kinds of things. So that was the shock that once it became apparent, people started to get worried. And once you get that panic, then, spending's going to fall. And so you're going to get that, a big leakage, and you're going to be so usually in a recession, something happens to cause aggregate demand to fall. What's really strange about the pandemic is it's quite different. So with the financial crisis, you could think of it as there was something sort of broken with the economy, but there was nothing broken with this pandemic. It's because we couldn't go out to restaurants, etc. So it was kind of forced, but yeah, so it's a little bit different of a scenario. Anyways, a contraction is when the economy slows down. A rough definition would be a decline in real output for a few months or so, and then we would call it a recession. A depression is just a really, really bad depression, a longer period of reduced real output. Expansions are when the economy is doing well. Economy tends to grow because of some kind of an increase in aggregate demand. Business cycle looks something like that. We typically see something happen like a shock that in the financial crisis before, like 2008, we were at something like point A, and then we ended up going to point D by 2019 or something like that. And then slowly over maybe an 8 or 10 year period, we went back up and got to another peak. And then happened with the COVID-19. Before the COVID-19, or even any talk of that, the unemployment rate was the lowest it's been in, I think in the US and Canada, was the lowest it's been in something like 30 years. We were doing very well, and we were at a good spot because we weren't exceeding potential and having high inflation. So we were doing very well, but then we, have this happening. So now we've had a contraction. Now, usually over the long term, when we go back up to that peak, the peak will be higher than the peak before. The reason for that is over time, there's an increase in the number of people. What are the things that affect potential output? Well, things like the number of people in the labor force, and another thing would be like technology and productivity. So there's for small boosts in productivity every year and the number of people in the labor force. Those tend to grow slowly over time, and so does our potential output. Okay, so there's two terms, a recessionary and an inflationary gap. A recessionary gap is when our actual GDP is below potential. Very simple. And an inflationary gap would be where our actual GDP is above the potential. And there you're worried, you have demand being very high and it's outstripping the economy's ability to supply it, so you get shortages and prices get bid up. So if we were at an intersection point E, where the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve are far below potential, to represent a recession, we would draw our aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve to the left of potential output. The farther it is to the left, the deeper the recession. Okay, so here it says periods of contraction lead to a decrease in aggregate demand, shifting the aggregate demand curve from A0 to A1. So in this diagram, they're saying we were initially at, say, point F, and then something happened to cause aggregate to fall a lot, and we ended up at point E. So that leads to a fall in equilibrium output from 730 to 700, and then so as a result, the initial inflationary gap of 5 billion turns into a recessionary gap of 25 billion. So periods of expansion reverse the change, so that would just be the other way around, where we have the aggregate demand curve going from AD1 to AD0. And so that would increase our equilibrium output from, we're just saying 80, if we're at AD0 first and then we go to AD1, that's a contraction. If we're at AD1 first and we go to AD0, that's an expansion. So here's a recessionary gap. So a recessionary gap, as I say again, it's just when the short run equilibrium is to the left of potential output. An inflationary gap is just the opposite. It's when it's to the right of potential output. Okay. Yeah, there's not too much else to say about this. Well, there is, but we'll get to that. But how do we get out of this, or should we just leave things alone? So I'll skip these for now because I want to make sure I finish at least this group of slides. Let me just see what's left here. Yeah, so we'll just move on now. So make sure you do those for homework. We'll move on to economic growth. So, economic growth when the economy is growing. So we could measure this in terms of real GDP, the percentage change in real GDP. Within a country, that makes sense to do because, within a country, if real GDP, the percentage change is positive, well, then the economy is growing. We may also want to think about, even still within a country, what does that real GDP represent? We can't say how good the standard of living is or the economic well-being of the people in a country by just having the real GDP figure, because we don't know how many people are sharing that real GDP. If real GDP is 10 billion and there's 5 people in the country, that's absolutely amazing. But if there's 20 billion people, then it's not very good. So we need to know the population. So another measure would be to look at the real GDP per capita over time. Okay, so that's a little more appropriate when measuring living standards. Whereas just looking at the percentage change in real GDP shows whether there's an increase in economic activity or productive capacity over time. But if you want some measure of living standards, we would want that by person. Although this of course isn't perfect because we know that there's not an equal distribution of the economic pie, right? Some people get more of it than others, but at least it gives us some sense of the living standard. So Canada's real GDP valued in 2007 dollars was that's not per capita. So this is just the real GDP was, $1.6 trillion. So in 2012, it was $1.6 trillion, but these, this is in 2000 dollars, right? So if this was converted to 2012 dollars, it would obviously be larger. And, it increased between 2012 and 2013. And so we could just calculate the percentage change here, the percentage increase, to get a measure of economic growth. We could also divide these figures each by the corresponding population in each year to get the real GDP per capita. So the percentage change here in real GDP was 2%. Okay, so the economy grew by 2%, and the percentage change in real GDP per capita grew by 0.8%. So here we're just taking this, dividing it by its population, this dividing it by its population, and then we're going to take the percentage change in real GDP per capita. The production possibilities curve is a good way just to illustrate the idea of economic growth. Obviously, we would represent economic growth with a shift outwards of the production possibilities curve, meaning, we increasing our potential, the amount that we could produce. If we were inside of the curve, the PPC, we were inside, so a point, say, in the middle somewhere, that would be like a recession. And if we move towards back to the boundary, that is, the economy is growing when we're doing that, but it's not really what we sort of think about when we think about economic growth. So just because we're in a recession and then we, get out of the recession, the economy's capacity or potential didn't change. We're just, we're in a bad situation and we're getting back to where we were before. So economic growth, you're usually thinking of the long-term increases in potential output. So again, here's our PPC curve. So this economy only has two goods, hamburgers and robots. If they put all of their resources into hamburgers, they would produce here. If they put all their resources into robots, they would produce here. Given their preferences, they might choose this combination. And so, by increasing their economic resources or improving their productivity, can the economy grow? And so if it somehow ends up coming up with new technology, or there's just a huge boost in the labor force or something like that, and that these increases in resources are useful in either of these two sectors, then we would draw it as a parallel shift. If there's an increase in resources that only apply to this good, then this would stay here and it would just sort of like rotate to the right around this point here. Because if the resources have nothing to do with hamburger production, then if we put all of our resources into hamburger production, that shouldn't change, right? We're still going to be at this point. So we represent a growing economy with a shift to the right PPC curve. That's the bottom line. If there's some kind of a natural disaster or something like that, then we would have a shift inwards like that. I think there's a bit of a typo here. This is, supposed to be for reduction in economic growth. Now, the reason why they chose robots and hamburgers in the example is because robots are capital goods and hamburgers are consumption goods. It also matters how much we invest in capital goods. So here, this economy is initially at point A, so they prefer to invest a lot into capital, not as much into consumption. So then, at some point in the future, their PPC curve will be, outward, could, shift out by quite a bit. And they could actually, now in the future, be able to consume a lot more for the same amount of robots. In this example here, they start out with, let me see what they're trying to get with this. So, so anyways, here, I don't know why they use C and D. They should have done A and B again. But if we're initially at this point, this country is not investing that much in capital. They're, spending a lot on consumption. They're not going to grow as much in the future. Okay, so, in the future, because of some investment in capital, their PPC curve will shift to the right. They might get to a point here where they can have 202 robots, but this country is going to be able to have much more consumption and the same amount of robots. So that's the idea. The more you invest in capital, the more this PPF curve or PPC curve will shift to the right. So now there's this thing called the rule of 70. It's very simple. You've probably seen it before. If something's growing at a compound interest rate, then you can easily, just on the back of an envelope, calculate how long it would take whatever it is to double. And all you would do is you simply take 72 and divide it by the interest rate. And so if the interest rate's 10%, you would divide by 10, not 0.10. And so if you do that, in this example here, we have something that's growing at 5% per year. And of course, whatever is growing at that 5% will double in 14.4 years. We're just going to take 72 divided by 5. This could be anything. And so this could be how fast the economy is growing. And as you can see, if an economy is growing at 3% per year and another economy is growing at 5% per year, the amount of years it'll take the one that's growing slower to double will be quite a bit longer. So you might think, 3% versus 5% isn't much of a big deal, but over time, the one with a bit higher growth rate will, if we're thinking of the growth rate in real GDP per capita, well, that will double much sooner than the other. And so we can use this, little tool here to we could just be given a growth rate. All you need to tell me is the growth rate of the country, and then I can take 72, divide by that number, and tell you how long it'll take for whatever series to double, right? If the real GDP per capita is growing at percent per year, then their real GDP per capita will double in 14.4 years. Yeah, this here is just sort of an example of that. If this economy is growing at 2%, this is growing at 4%. In just only 11 years, there's a big difference between the real GDP, right? If we did this for real GDP per capita, we would find a similar thing. And of course, if we looked at how long it would take this to double and that to double, there would be quite a bit of a difference. So I think, okay, so yeah, we might only be covering this today. So we'll start covering fiscal policy next class. So let's just finish up with sources of economic growth. So we know that the main cause of growth is in real output is the quantity of labor. So the more people you have, the more you're going to be able to produce. But labor productivity is also extremely important. Labor productivity is why we are so much more better off now than 150 years ago. It's not as if just workers became, a lot of people get this impression, they weren't working that hard or now they're just better workers. No, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the capital, labor saving devices. Back 150 years ago, you needed a much, much larger proportion of the population working in agriculture just so we had enough food. And still you have the odd, well, not in Canada, but in some countries you still, even in China, wasn't that long ago, 40 years ago, roughly, there was a famine, right? So anyways, labor productivity is extremely important. And labor productivity improves because of technological advances. So because of all of the advances in agricultural implements and whatever other tools they use, barely 5% of the population needs to work in agriculture anymore. And we have more food than we know. So labor productivity is key to, increasing the standard of living. It's essentially just output per worker per hour. So you can think of it, you could take GDP, and then, look at the number of people who work, look at average hours worked, and you can get a rough estimate of the number of hours used to produce our GDP. And then if you divide those, you get a measure of productivity. The Economist says that labor productivity is probably the most telling measure of economic performance. Unless productivity grows, living standards stagnate. And if you look at any measure of labor productivity and then you look at a measure of something like real wages or something like that, which measures our standard of living, they're very, very highly correlated. I'll just let you do this for homework. Don't worry too much about this. Well, let's just go over it quickly. We have a hypothetical economy with 5 workers employed for 2,000 hours annually. So the economy that obviously uses 10,000 hours of labor, 5 times 2,000. And so if the real GDP in the economy is $200,000, then labor productivity is just obtained from taking 200,000 and dividing it by 10,000. So here labor productivity is in terms of GDP or that output, it's $20. So we can say that $20 of value per hour per worker is what the productivity is. Productivity has to be per worker per hour, right? So here it's $20 per worker per hour. Of course, if real GDP rises to 202 the following year and labor hours remain constant, then there must have been an increase in productivity. So now, if we calculate productivity, it's going to be 202,000 divided by 10,000. And so the productivity now is 20.2 per worker per hour. And that represents an increase of 1%. Okay, we already talked about this, but these are the things that are behind our potential output. Okay? And so any improvement in these things will change our potential output and our factors of economic growth. If we were all stranded on an island and we thought about these things, we clearly could see how our standard of living would be higher. If we have a carpenter with us, so they have higher skills, we're going to have better huts or whatever shelter that we can build. If we have a farmer with us with those skills, we're going to eat better, right? So labor productivity in selected countries. So this is the percentage change between 1995 and 2012. and this is this color here is 2007, 2012. So it looks like labor productivity seems to here it looks like it's fallen a bit. It deteriorated significantly between 2007 and 2012, similar to other countries. So yeah, there's some patterns. Not too much, interesting. So again, I'll let you do all of. Oh, so we just have a little more content here. Now, I mean, we're just talking here about the advantages and disadvantages of growth. I mean, of course, the advantages are a better material standard of living. Some of this can go into better healthcare and that sort of thing, so that would be a benefit. There's obviously somewhat of a relationship between that and social improvements and psychological benefits. Although I heard that, money does make you happy if you are very poor and you get an increase in your income that lets you have a little more freedom and just some of the necessities in life and maybe a nice house and that sort of thing. But, you can think of the first change in a change of $100,000 in your income. That first 100,000 will give you much more happiness than another 100,000 because you already have stuff. So there is a relationship between, income or money and, things like happiness and psychological benefits, but, it only goes so far. We could have a real high GDP per capita, but if we don't have any leisure, that's not a good thing, right? And then disadvantages, opportunity cost in terms of sacrifice current consumption. So if we give up a lot of consumption to put in the capital goods, well then, there's an opportunity cost associated with that. Environmental costs, if we're destroying the environment to grow the economy, that's not a good thing. There could be some social costs, especially if people are working too hard, that sort of thing. So there are some disadvantages of economic growth, but, it depends on your perspective how bad each of those could be. This is how Canada has grown since 1870. This is capita, real GDP. So we can compare this over time. So our, per capita GDP went from 2,000 up to close to 40,000. So that's quite a large increase. And you can see growth sort of was faster and slower certain periods over others. You're thinking of the percentage change in here. It was gradual between 1870 and 1914. Still not too bad. And then there were steep upswings in the 1920s and 30s here, but an abrupt decline in the early 30s. Well, that's because of the Great Depression. And until 1973, there was steady growth in per capita income, averaging around 2% per year. So the average growth rate has been less since the mid-1990s. So maybe this AI or artificial intelligence or something like that might be the thing that can boost our productivity even further and further increase our standard of living. Okay, so I'll let you do these for homework. I don't worry too much about these. I didn't put these in here. I forgot to remove them. They were from another instructor. But you can skim over them and skim over them, look at them. But they're maybe sometimes a little different than the actual textbook material. Okay, so I think that's good for today. There's quite a bit of material. Make sure you read the textbook, do the suggested problems. Okay, take care, guys. Bye.